Hey guys, welcome to this video on the paper 3 case study for 2026. This case study is entitled An Ethical Approach to Hacking. Now in this video, we're going to be covering the content for the paper 3 that will be given in May and November 2026. We're going to start by covering the scenario that is described in the case study, and then going through the actual content of the case study itself. In addition, in the description, you can find a link to a cram guide with a bunch of useful and concise information that helps you study for this exam, including the slides, as well as two predicted practice papers. It's two practice papers I've come up with that I think will reflect what the actual exam is going to look like. Now, just some notes on this case study. This case study is going to be the last case study for the old curriculum. There's going to be a new computer science curriculum in 2027 that's going to have a very different structure. And I don't know if this is the reason why, but it does seem like this case study is generally easier than the previous case studies. It just doesn't feel as technical. There's lots of information given in the case study itself that makes it seem like there's not a lot of research that's required. But in my opinion, I think that just means that we can expect questions based more on further research. So research on concepts that are connected to the case study, but for which information is not given in the case study, as well as questions that require you to go further than just like regurgitating information, but that are actually require you to apply concepts to specific scenarios that you may not have seen before, but that are related to the context given in the case study. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's take a look at what the scenario is. So we have a IT firm, or rather a computer security firm called Cyber Health Security that wants to penetrate MedTech Pro Hospital's network. So they're not penetrating it in sort of the negative sense, although using the word penetrate in general just evokes all sorts of both positive and negative connotations that I'm not going to get into. But the point of this is that Cyber Security has been hired by MedTech Pro to conduct something called penetration testing. And that means that Cyber Health Security is going to go ahead and they're going to try to test MedTech Pro's IT networks to see how vulnerable they are to hackers. And once they find these vulnerabilities, they're going to help MedTech Pro better secure their network against hackers. Now, MedTech Pro has certain aspects of their computer network, specifically data that they really want to protect. The first is going to be electronic health records. So those are just patient records, records that contain data for each individual patient. And for both a privacy perspective and the perspective providing positive healthcare outcomes, it's quite important for them to secure this data. If they lose this data, they basically don't know anything about their patients or their patient's medical history, which can be deeply problematic. Internal communications. So this could be communications between doctors who are discussing the prognoses and situations surrounding their patients, as well as conceivably even communications with patients. So with members of the public who are using the services of this hospital. Finally, network medical devices that fall under the umbrella of Internet of Things. So, which is IoT for short. So when we're talking about Internet of Things, we're essentially talking about devices other than computers that are hooked up to the internet, that can be accessed, whose data can be accessed or which can be controlled through the internet or really through a computer network. Now, these could be devices that simply provide information on a patient's status. So, for example, a patient might be sitting in their hospital room, and there might be a device that collects their vital signs that's connected to the internet, so the doctor can monitor their condition over the internet. Or it might be devices that actually directly affect the care of the patient. So these could be devices that dispense insulin, that dispense painkillers, that can be controlled remotely. And especially with those devices that are used to directly provide care, you can imagine why it's important for a hospital to secure those. Because if a hacker gets access to those types of devices, then they could potentially just kill a patient remotely. So just overall, Cyber Health Security has been hired to assess system security and ensure privacy of patient data. Those are really the two overarching objectives in this scenario. Now that you kind of have an understanding what the scenario is, we haven't really completely covered the scenario overview, but we're going to cover that. After that, we're going to cover 7 phases in this whole penetration testing process, a possible response plan as a result of penetration testing, and then some ethical considerations surrounding penetration testing in a healthcare context. Now, I've kind of already talked about what penetration testing is, but just to kind of rehash it, it's essentially a simulated cyber attack, right? So it's a controlled, authorized attempt, authorized by the client, which in this case is MTPH, the hospital that's hired this IT firm. And they're hired to exploit security vulnerabilities in a system, network, or application. So in this case, we're talking about the hospital's network. so the network that connects all the different devices and computers that are inside the hospital. But penetration testing could also be used against an application, so against a specific software application, to see how that could be taken advantage of by hackers, or perhaps how malware could be inserted into an application, as well as just generally any computer-based systems. The idea is to identify weaknesses, and these might be vectors for very sophisticated hacks to go in and to take over a particular computer, turn it into a bot, and affect all the other computers. Or it could just be things like unpatched software, weak passwords that can be easily guessed for access into the system, or misconfigurations that make software less secure than it should be and allow outside entities to get access to a network. And the overall goal of this, as we said before, is to strengthen the defenses so that if a real hacker tries to access the system, then it's much more difficult for them. Now, in this specific case study, this diagram is taken from the case study. The penetration testing process is going to follow 7 phases, and we're going to go through each one of these phases, right? And it's called the Penetration Testing Execution Standard. And this is sort of an industry-wide framework for how penetration testing takes place. It's not just something that's been made up by the IB. And so we'll be following this throughout this video and explaining each one of these different phases and the different methodologies or the different techniques that are used to execute these phases in the context of this case study. So we're going to start with the first phase, which is called pre-engagement interactions. And if you're just going to break this down, pre-engagement interactions. So this is basically conversations happening before the actual penetration testing takes place. And this is where the cyber health security team and the MTPH team, which is the team at the hospital, they sit down and they come up with a plan basically for how penetration testing is going to go. They basically discuss what needs to happen, so what some of the goals are, what some of the boundaries are for this testing, and how this is really going to be executed both in terms of timeline and logistics. And also they're going to talk about some of the ethical parameters, so some aspects, some ethical sort of boundaries for how this penetration testing can take place. So we're going to go through each one of these. So first of all, they're going to basically discuss the goals. So it isn't really specified in the case study, but the hospital may be facing specific threats from certain countries, certain hacking groups, or really just even certain types of cyber attacks. And so this is going to be discussed, and this is going to be formulated into goals. And these goals are going to guide the type of hacks, the different ways that the cyber health security team is going to try to test MTPH's IT network, right? Or sorry, rather than just their network. IT network is a bit redundant, I suppose. Then scope. So scope is basically like how much of this network and what parts of this network do we really want to test. So depending on the goals of the hospital's IT team and what they predict their threats are, we may not be testing every single aspect of the network. We may not be trying to get access to all the data in the network. But there might be specific areas of the network that the hospital wants the cyber health security team to focus on over others. We've got rules of engagement. So rules of engagement are exactly what types of ways the security team can try to access the hospital's networks. So there are different types of ways to get access to a network. One way could even just be taking advantage of employees in order to get information about the network and then get access to it. Rules of engagement kind of guides like what is okay and what's not in terms of the security team getting access to the network. Next, you have logistics. So physical logistics, where the team will be located, what physical areas will have access to, what physical systems might have access to. Administrative. Now, the cyber health security team may need some sort of permission. They might need some kind of documents that provide them access to the system from an administrative level. And personnel. This might be giving access to certain personnel from the cyber health team to certain aspects of the hospital's network, or even just to the hospital facility itself. These all need to be considered in this initial discussion before penetration testing can take place. Following, we'll have a timeline. So this is going to happen over 72 hours. This is going to happen over 3 months. Like, how long is this penetration testing going to take? And then ethical parameters. So particularly when working with patient data, there's going to need to be certain rules, certain ethical guidelines that the security team is going to have to respect. For example, by the very nature of this engagement, the cyber health security team is probably going to be asked to try to gain access to patient data. And once they do, they're probably going to need to be asked to not release any data that they have found in the system publicly, and to not even maybe save it on their own systems, right? So this is a test, and they will probably get access to patient data, but there's going to be certain ethical parameters that guide how they can use that data, what they can do with it, and what are certain measures they need to take to respect the privacy of the patients whose data they have gotten access to. Now, this is actually the section from the case study that is basically a description of the pre-engagement interactions. And I kind of made this a lot more concise in this description right here. So I've kind of boiled it down to its essentials, but I still want to go through and talk it through any concepts I may not have covered. So we kind of already talked about goal setting. And according to the case study, these key concerns may be patient data integrity. So making sure patient data is not deleted, is not corrupted by some outside entity, uninterrupted service delivery. So making sure the system is always up to give both patients and hospital staff, including doctors, access to their data, and compliance with health sector regulations. So the hospital may want to comply with certain security-related aspects of legal regulations that guide their hospital, or that govern their hospital's functions. And so they may be asking the security team to make sure that the MTPH of the hospital is actually following these regulations, and that their security meets the regulations that may have been set forth by some government body. We also kind of talked about specific targets, and we kind of did this more in terms of scope, but the hospital may be focusing on the patient record databases or medical devices for reasons we talked about before. So in this pre-engagement discussion, we're going to talk about specific targets, and that corresponds to the scope that we mentioned before. And test boundaries will be confirmed to avoid any unintended interruption. So this is kind of like combining, I would say, scope and rules of engagement, but there may be certain areas that just can't be tested because they're so essential to the functionality of the hospital. And this needs to be discussed in the pre-engagement interactions. And again, right here, we explicitly see rules of engagement. And this is basically just the methods that are acceptable for this penetration testing. Now, what we're going to talk about next, that's kind of part of this phase, is the testing approaches. And really, one of these testing approaches is going to be chosen to guide the overall approach that the security team is going to take towards testing this particular hospital system. And there are three possibilities. The first is black box testing. And this is when a security team approaches a system, approaches a network, without having any idea as to how the network is structured, how it's configured, or what's actually going on in the network. So this is where the security team has never actually been inside the network before, so they don't really know what the vulnerabilities are and what the most efficient way would be to break into it. They're just starting from scratch. The next possible approach is white box testing, and this is when the security team has had a significant amount of time inside the network to actually understand what the vulnerabilities are. Finally, we have gray box testing, which is kind of a mix of black box and white box testing. The security team has some knowledge of the network's workings and possible vulnerabilities, but not all of it. So this is meant to simulate an insider threat. So this may be a disgruntled IT employee or simply a nurse that is underpaid and has too much free time on their hands that would like to gain access to the system and possibly blackmail the hospital, or just, create havoc because they're just really pissed off, which that happens not infrequently. Now, we're going to look at some of the pros and cons of each of these. So with black box testing, where the security team has never really seen the insides of the network and hasn't really had time to understand the specific vulnerabilities of a network, there are some advantages and disadvantages. So first of all, this is more realistic because most actors that are going to attack a network are probably going to be not necessarily from another country, but a lot of times, a lot of different hacking groups will just go through a list, right, of institutions and just go through each one really quick and try to figure out which one has some pretty obvious vulnerabilities and then attack those. So especially if you're taking into consideration the fact that probably most attackers are not really going to be familiar with the institution, this is perhaps the most realistic. Also, we could say it's less biased because the security team they haven't had a lot of time with the system, right? They're not going to they're just going to take a general overview of the security stance of the system and then just try to attack based on that. So it kind of goes back to this first point, really. They're not really focusing on any one aspect. They're kind of looking at it from the perspective of an outsider who doesn't know about the network. And particularly if an institution thinks that this is the most common threat, then this is an advantage. Now, there are also some disadvantages. First of all, this doesn't really take into account any insider threats or any hackers that may be more sophisticated and may already have done some reconnaissance and have a deep knowledge of the network. So it's not really going to take into account more sophisticated penetrations. And it also will not provide the institution with knowledge of deeper vulnerabilities, more complex vulnerabilities that may be able to be attacked by a more sophisticated hacker. And if vulnerabilities sounds like a pretty open-ended term, we'll talk about what those are later on, but these are essentially just weaknesses, right? So some weaknesses are easier to find than others and require less time to find than others. And so those weaknesses that are obvious and take very little time to find, we can probably address in black box testing, but not those weaknesses that are less difficult, or sorry, that take more time to find. That being said, if we're just doing black box testing because there's no advanced knowledge of how the system works, then it can take much longer time to uncover weaknesses. And finally, as we kind of talked about before, these more deeper vulnerabilities, we may just miss those, right? Just because like we are spending so much time just trying to understand how the system works on a surface level that we don't really have time to go in and to really investigate some of the more complex issues, some of the more complex weaknesses that can arise. For example, and to give you an example of a complex issue, this might be an issue that's only triggered by accessing 3 different systems or gaining access to 3 different systems in the network rather than just one system. Or that might be a specific way to access one particular web server that corresponds to the software that's stored on that web server in the network. Then once you get access to that web server, you get access to the rest of the network. So just kind of weaknesses that require multiple layers, that require you to get through multiple layers of security or multiple types of software to be able to take advantage of. Now next we have, this should not be black box testing, this should be white box testing. Remember, white box testing, that's going to be when the attacker, in this case the security firm, has quite detailed, not necessarily detailed, but quite thorough access, or has had thorough access to the computer network. So they've had a month, maybe they've had weeks beforehand to go through the network and figure out exactly what the very specific vulnerabilities are, including those more complex vulnerabilities that we discussed when we were talking about black box testing. So there's some advantages and disadvantages to this approach. So first of all, we're going to have we're going to be able to get a more thorough understanding of what the vulnerabilities are of the system, both the complex and simple vulnerabilities. This is going to be more efficient because, like, once the security team has had time with the system, they can understand what the most high-risk vulnerabilities are, what the most likely vectors of attack are, and just kind of focus on those. And again, more time means that we can kind of uncover more complex and more layered weaknesses that maybe take a little bit more sophistication to get access to. However, a major disadvantage is that this takes a lot of time with the system even before the penetration testing has happened. And it might be unrealistic because most hackers probably wouldn't have a month inside a computer system, wouldn't have a large amount of time inside a computer system to really investigate and to figure out what the weaknesses of that system are. And this may lead to the security team focusing on very specific weaknesses rather than looking at the system as a whole from the perspective of your average attacker. Finally, we have gray box testing, which is a mixture of the two. And I think this is kind of perceived in general as being perhaps the most realistic avenue of performing penetration testing, because you're kind of basically taking the perspective of a hacker that has had maybe some access, that might be an insider, or that might have just spent a bit of time investigating their target, but does not have a sophisticated understanding, does not have the same level of understanding that, for example, the IT team of the hospital might have. So you get a more balanced perspective on the actual weaknesses. You're more likely to detect a wide range of issues that are probably more likely to be targeted by an adversarial hacker. And this tends to be a bit more efficient because you're not spending a bunch of time investigating the network itself. You're spending a less amount of time, but again, you're getting more realistic perspective on what a possible hack or what a possible cyber attack would look like. However, still, I mean, you're not necessarily going to be able to address those very complex issues because you don't fully understand the system, and you haven't done a thorough investigation of the system itself. And this is going to be a more more moderated, a more targeted approach with a more clearly defined scope, right, of what systems can be accessed and what systems can't. So kind of making sure that the cyber attack, the simulated cyber attack done by the security team fits the parameters of gray box testing, requires more planning, a lot more judgment into what is the most appropriate level of access that a team conducting gray box testing should get. Now, once we've actually had our discussion as to what the simulated cyber attack is going to look like, the penetration testing team, the security team, is going to go ahead and conduct intelligence gathering. So they're going to kind of approach the system from the perspective of an outside hacker or even just a malicious entity that even maybe has access to the system, and try to gain as much intelligence as possible on the system. Although I would say that this kind of corresponds more to black box testing, because you wouldn't really need to find information out about the network and the people operating the network if you have full access to the system itself. So probably this intelligence gathering phase more applies to black box testing or gray box testing. But let's get into what this phase actually entails. Okay, so now to kind of dive into what intelligence gathering actually is in the context of this case study, it's basically collecting information about a target system or organization. And this includes both passive methods and active methods. Now, some examples of passive methods could just be using like a search engine to look up the staff of the IT staff of a particular organization, and through that to be able to maybe guess passwords, maybe able to actually like to find out just more information about how the system for that organization might be structured. For example, if you have a highly qualified IT staff with 20 years of experience, then you might have to take a different approach towards the system than if you have like an intern just running the entire hospital's IT system, right? There might actually be more active methods, like, I don't know, calling up different members of the IT staff and blackmailing them to give you the passwords to enter the system. But you're gonna have both passive and active methods. And the main goal of intelligence gathering overall is to be able to understand how best to gain access to a particular computer network. And that can include things like particular IP addresses to target, ports that are open that we can use to enter a network, or even it could be the ability to use, for example, phishing scams to allow employees to give you access to the network through emails that you send them. So how are we going to get access to this network? How are we going to get access to the data on this network? That's what we're trying to figure out in the intelligence gathering phase. And this is phase 2 in the p-test process. We just talked about phase 1. So specifically, when we're doing our intelligence gathering, we're looking for different pieces of data. So we're looking for employee details, which we kind of just talked about, particularly for those in IT and administrative roles. We're trying to figure out what type of software and hardware is used, so what operating system is generally used, what types of software is used to run the web servers, and what is the hardware, what are the actual types of computer systems, and for example, how much memory they have, what kind of CPUs they use. So what does that hardware look like on the systems that power the network that we're targeting? Finally, what are the security policies? So these could be both physical security policies, so how could we actually get access to the IT systems, to the computers that make up this network, as well as what software-based security processes are there. And this can be found just online just by trying to, for example, log into the network through a public portal. Now, there's some specific ways that we're going to go through that this intelligence gathering phase is executed. The first is through targeted information gathering. So this could be by using a technique called search engine dorking, which we'll talk about earlier, and even just going online and trying to find ways to log into the system, ways to get access to the system. Also, we'll do something called network scanning and mapping. And this is by using specific types of software to scan a computer network and to figure out in what way different devices are connected, and also even just what devices are on the network. And we can do this by using tools like port scanning, port scanners, OS detection tools, and IP address cataloging. And next, we're going to have something called social engineering or reconnaissance. And this could be by even just calling up employees or contacting employees in some way in order to trick them into revealing information about a network. Now, the whole sort of goal in the context of this p-test framework of intelligence gathering is to formulate a security posture assessment. And this is to evaluate the organization's ability to defend against cyber threats, to kind of get an overview of what its policies are, tools, and practices, that can make it either more hardened against cyber attacks or more weak with regards to cyber attacks, to identify weaknesses that can be used in subsequent penetration testing, in the actual simulated cyber attack that's going to take place. So we can figure out what vulnerabilities there are, what configurations or behaviors that could be used to attack. And based on this risk evaluation and the identification of weaknesses, we can create a custom penetration test to allow us to exploit the system. So overall, the security posture assessment is something that we come up with. It could be a document, it could be just a list of both characteristics of the system and possible weaknesses that we come up with that will influence how we're going to conduct our simulated cyber attack against the system in subsequent phases of this p-test process. Okay, so now that we know what a security posture assessment is, let's move forward and take a look at some of the different concepts that are connected to this phase. So the first one we're going to talk about is OSINT, or open source intelligence. And in this phase, this phase is called intelligence gathering, right? So what OSINT is it's a way for us to gather information on a target. This could be an institution, this could be a person, this could be any entity with a presence online, using tools that are available to us that we generally don't have to pay for and that everyone has access to. So OSINT involves gathering information from publicly available sources like websites, social media, and forums, with actually social media being one of the most common avenues through which we can gather open source intelligence. This doesn't involve any hacking. There's no, you're not sneaking in anywhere. You're just accessing and analyzing data that's available to everyone in a legal way. And a lot of information we get through OSINT can help us better understand how to infiltrate or how to enter a network in an unauthorized way. Oftentimes, this can include things like leaked information, digital footprints that gives us clues as to how the personnel at our institution works, or how those IT networks interact with the internet or the outside world. And there may even be some other potential information that clues us into vulnerabilities. Now, with some of the different concepts that we cover, we're going to be taking a look at real-world examples. And I think one great example that illustrates exactly what OSINT is and how it works is an investigation done by an organization called Bellingcat. And this organization basically used OSINT to geolocate, meaning to find the geographical location of Russian missile programmers. And these are people who program Russian rockets to come blow up civilian targets, for example, maternity wards or schools in Ukraine. Now, this is the picture of this programming team right here. And basically the idea behind this open source investigation was that this organization wanted to figure out exactly where these people were located and perhaps even understand exactly who they are, identify them. So first of all, they found a leaked photo online, as well as, and this showed people, laptops, and documents related to the project. Obviously, this picture just shows people, but there were other photos as well. And based on those photos, they were able to go online. I believe they just went to Google Maps, and they were able to match a window in one of the pictures they got with something that with an image that was seen through Google Street Maps. And additionally, there was a photo. There was in this sort of group of leaked photos, there was a phone number, and that phone number they were actually able to look up online to find the identity of the person who's connected to that phone number, and basically find out their name and personal details, etc. Once they found this person, then they're able to go through social media and identify other people in this picture that were located to that particular person, and then do more OSINT analysis in order to find out their personal information and other details that are connected to them, including their military links, for example, their rank is, where they're employed, what unit they're in, etc. And basically by the end of this, using information that was completely publicly available, they were able to find the structure of the team, find employment records that are matching them, and find a great deal of information connected to what's supposed to be a secret missile unit, right? Because this unit's actively participating in the war in Ukraine. Now, OSINT analysis can play a big part in allowing us to find more information out about our targets. So this was a secret missile unit in the case of a hospital. We could find out a lot of information about the IT staff. We could possibly find out information that could be used to help figure out some passwords to log in. We could also perhaps find out information about who usually accesses this platform, who has ties to the hospital, who has ties to the IT system. I suppose that's going to be more connected to, this is going to be more connected to the people that are interacting with the IT system, but it's possible we could find other more technical information just online. However, where OSINT doesn't necessarily work, where just looking at social media profiles doesn't work, there are other techniques we can use, and we're going to call these reconnaissance techniques. Reconnaissance being the term for, reconnaissance is really a military term, when soldiers, maybe a small group of soldiers, tries to go towards enemy positions or behind enemy positions to find out information before the rest of the army comes and attacks the target. So in this case, we'd be trying to do some investigation of our target system, of our target computer system, before our security team actually tries to come in and enter the system, basically to conduct a cyber attack, a simulated cyber attack on the system. And what we find out during our reconnaissance using these techniques will help us better target and break into that system. So we've got a list of techniques, search engine dorking, which does not involve dorks, but you get the idea. Network analysis, port scanning, OS detection, IP address cataloging, vishing, and pretexting. We're going to go through all of these. The first technique we're going to talk about is going to be search engine dorking. And basically how this works is we try to look for entry points into an IT system that are available online by putting very specific queries into Google. Now, I don't know if you can see this. This is kind of small, but right here, we're entering a query in for John Doe, but we're adding some terms that perhaps you never put into Google before, but still work. So there's a whole sophisticated language and syntax we can use for search terms that are being entered to Google. And right here, we're presumably looking for a docx document that contains the terms John Doe. Now, easily, we could do the same thing for our hospital, except we can include the name of the hospital and security protocol. Or we could include the name of the hospital and login info, or easiest way to log in as a document. And using these types of search techniques, we can find all kinds of things like login pages, error messages, confidential documents, and we can even access servers that are maybe not as secured as they used to by using more sophisticated search techniques. And again, technically this is OSINT actually, because we're not really breaking in anywhere. We're just making our search engine work for us in a very specific way. And this is legal and doesn't involve breaking into any systems. It's just an advanced, non-traditional search technique that's often used to find hidden or sensitive information that you wouldn't find just by putting in a more straightforward search term. Now, another good example right here is the term index of. So index of basically gives us the root directory of a server. So it basically gives us like the main file path in a server through which we can access all the other files. And so if you can find that for a particular server, that means we can access all the different other files in a server, especially if the index of that address isn't secured and provides us some kind of authorization to access different files. There's also, right here, we're looking for an environmental variable, which generally contains secret passwords for different services that a website or a web application is going to be using. So this is just an example of how just using Google, we might be able to get access to sophisticated information, a sophisticated set of information, and access to information, perhaps the whole file server, that we may not otherwise be able to get access to. Even further, right here, we're trying to go to netatlas.io, and we're specifically looking for a login handle like this. And this is maybe something that's, basically this would give us like a login window, right? So we could go type in a password and username, which we might be able to get in some other way. And this is just an example of how we could find a login page that we might not otherwise see on the homepage or on the website itself. Just to give an example of how this has been used in real life, similar to how we did for OSINT. One good example of dorking. So this is an example of using Google dorking. So putting some specialized search terms to dorking, as well as using a search engine called Shodan that lets us actually look up devices that are connected to the internet. So we talked about how you could connect like an insulin pump, or you could connect a device that collects patient vital information to the internet. Through this search engine, we could find those types of devices using specialized search terms. And basically, there was a very specific case where So there were a couple of cases. There was one case in 2014 where some researchers were able to get access to a water treatment plant's control panel through using these methods without having to type in any passwords at all whatsoever, which means they could basically control the water supply for a small city just by Google, just by finding the control panel for that water treatment system through Google. There's another example here where a hacker is able to get access to a city's water supply and actually poison the water by increasing the amount of sodium hydroxide that's in the water. And I'm not 100% sure, but I assume that's something that's used to kill germs in wastewater or to in some way purify the water before it's distributed to the citizens of the city. But this as well. I did a little bit of research into this, and this was actually done via Dorking as well. So Dorking is one method, and that kind of falls under the umbrella of more advanced search techniques. Now we're going to get into how we can actually work with a target network, or how we can sort of analyze a target network to get more information about it and eventually make a successful cyber attack on that network. So there are a few ways that we assess and analyze networks. Or basically, there's a few ways that we collect information in networks, right? The first way is through network scanning. And what this does is this allows us to find a bunch of different information about the networks as like a list. So we can find live hosts, meaning we can find the IP addresses of devices that are on that network. We can find open ports. And ports are basically portals that each computer has that are numbered. And different types of services use different types of ports. So for example, if we're running a web server and a web application, then that's going to be connected to port 80, and we might open that port up. So for example, if we have an IP address of like 129.12.31.04, and we have an open port for a web application, we could access it like this, and someone could get access to our web server. If it's not secured, if there's no login page here, then someone could get access our web server and they could access all the files there. So we generally want to have ports secured, but using a network scanning tool. So conducting network scanning using specialized software, we could find that, and often other vulnerabilities as well. So this is kind of one of the first things we do when we're doing intelligence gathering, just to see, okay, like what IP addresses can we see in the system, what ports are open, what ways, like what different services could we possibly access on these different computers. And generally we just get a list of the devices in the network, right? Which is a good starting point. Additionally, we can also find out what types of services, what types of software are running on these devices, which can be super helpful. Now the next step kind of goes a bit more in depth, and that's network mapping. And we use data gathered from scanning, and we can make further inquiries into the devices that we detected using scanning. So we can find out things like what the role is in the network, how they're configured, again, what software, what settings are loaded and being used on these devices, and even things like, for example, like just their identity. So what they're called, what operating system they're using possibly, what kind of device they are. All these things we would find using network mapping. So just getting kind of a better idea of the different devices that are in the network and basically what they do. And then finally, we're going to get network topology mapping. And topology is often used in like environmental science, and it basically means like how the landscape is structured, right? So like, if we're thinking about the topology of a mountain range, then it's going to be very distinct from the topology of a plane, for example. Now, this same paradigm applies to networks, and we're talking about network topology mapping. We're basically talking about how different devices in the network are connected to each other and how data flows through the system. Now, a good example of what network topology would look like would be if we have a router, and then we have a firewall behind that router, and behind that firewall we have multiple devices. But then maybe we have one device connected to the router that doesn't go through the firewall. But that device is connected to devices that are behind the firewall. So that gives us a way to get in behind the firewall, right? So basically we see different devices. So I mean, when we're doing network topology mapping, we're not simply talking about computers, we're also talking about other network devices, which we may have detected during network mapping. The difference here is we're seeing how different computers are organized within a network, how they're connected to those different devices, and sort of in what configuration. So we're just getting a much more in-depth understanding of the structure of a network, which can be really important, as I said before, in finding ways around firewalls, finding ways around devices that are configured as security mechanisms. Now, I'm just going to go through some examples of each one of these because these terms are actually on the case study, so it's important to understand what each of these are. So we've got network scanning, and remember that one is just finding a list of devices. So we could use, if we're doing network scanning, we could use a piece of software called Nmap. We could scan a range of IP addresses to find out which one of these IP addresses match something in the network. And we've discovered 12 devices, and 3 of which have open SSH ports. And SSH is a service, it's a protocol that we can use to remotely access a device through the command line. So this means that if they have open SSH ports, presumably there are 3 computers that we could just go in our command line, type in a few commands, and we could get in there and access the services and files on that system. Also, we may see that some of them have outdated Apache versions. And Apache is basically a service. It's basically a service that we use to host web applications. If they're outdated, that means they may not be as secure as they should be. So we might be able to easily find a piece of software online we could use to get access to this outdated version, this outdated and presumably less secure version of Apache, which means we could hijack a web application that makes use of this Apache software and that sits on one of these 12 computers. So that's network scanning. So we go ahead and do network scanning. Next, we go to network mapping. And so once we do in our network mapping phase, we can find a map showing each device's IP address, their operating system, and any services, some of which we may have gotten in scanning, but we're just getting more information in the network mapping phase. And so based on all of this, we can sort of prioritize which machines we should target first and where we're most likely to have success in terms of getting access to a computer on the network and hopefully getting access to more computers on that network. And then finally, we have our network topology mapping phase where we're looking at the overall structure of the network. And so here we use a piece of software to conduct network topology mapping. And by the way, all of these different phases, there's specialized software that you could easily download and learn how to use in like 30 minutes that would allow you to do this. In fact, if you're ever interested, there's an operating system called Kali Linux that is heavily used for penetration testing. And it contains all these pieces of software, so it's a great platform for just learning how to hack into computers. Anyways, so network topology mapping, basically we decide to use a tool to examine the network topology of our network that we're targeting, in this case a hospital, right? We see we have a central router, and it's connected to 3 virtual local networks. So kind of 3 networks that are not technically separate, but are configured to be separate. And the VLAN is actually a term that comes up in the network topic for paper 1. So if you don't understand what that is, go ahead and check that out. But basically these different virtual local area networks should all be isolated from each other. But through our network topology mapping, we find out that someone hasn't configured a firewall to make sure that computers in those different virtual local area networks can't interact with each other. And that means that if we get access to one virtual local area network, then we can get access to others. And so we may not immediately have a way to get access to one virtual local area network, but this just gives us another piece of the puzzle as to how we can infiltrate this particular computer network. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at some more specific tools that fall under the umbrella of network mapping and network scanning, and are going to be a part of whatever tools we use that fall under the umbrellas or fall under those particular names or classification. Now the first is a port scanner, so a piece of software that conducts port scanning, right? We kind of already talked about that. And that's something that probably would fall under a network scanning, the umbrella of a network scanner. But this identifies open and closed ports. So as I told you, like you're gonna have an IP address, and then if you're running a particular service that's open to the internet, or that's open to the outside world, then that service is gonna access your computer, your IP address via your port. So again, remember it was like 129.1.1.3, that's our IP address. But we have a website, and we're hosting a web server. And that website lives on the web server. We want people from the outside world to access it. One way or another, they're going to get access to port 80, and this would be the address that they access. Now, usually, like you're not going to see that port 80, but it kind of depends on the service. But if you, for example, we talked about SSH, which allows you to like command line into a computer. That's going to be port 22, and usually you actually do need to type that into your command line, right? So port 80 usually don't because it's so common and your browser already knows that you're going there. But anyway, so these ports are basically kind of a substructure. They're kind of a channel, they're kind of a channel and a set of channels that allow access to your computer at its IP address. And using port scanning, we can kind of view what ports are functional, what are open, what ports are working, what ports are open to the outside world, what ports are secure, and what ports are not. So using port scanning software, we're going to send requests to various ports. And what helps is that different software platforms use the same port all the time. So for example, a web server is always going to use port 80. And a file transfer protocol server is always going to use, I think it's like 3306, or maybe that's like a database server. But like software, different types of software generally always use the same server. So anyone would know, you could do a Google search and find out what ports to scan and then put it into the software. The software is going to go ahead and scan different ports and see which ones respond. So which ones are open, which ones are closed, which ones are filtered to only allow certain other IP addresses to access those ports, and which ones have restricted access. And when we actually query these ports, we can also detect which services are operating. So for example, if you get a response from port 80, we know that an HTTP server is working. Or on port 22, we know that an SSH server is on that computer. It's a service that's on that computer that we can go access at that particular port, assuming it's not like secured in any way. Sometimes we can even get the version of the software. So again, if there's an older piece of software that we can access through that port, then there may be a what's called an exploit online. So there may be another piece of code online we can use to then gain access to that. This is important for security testing, so that we know that whatever ports are open to the world are secured, and they're configured correctly, and that whatever ports shouldn't be open just aren't open at all. So here's a real-world example of when attackers are able to use port scanning. So basically, they conducted a port scan on JP Morgan Chase's servers, which if you don't know, that's like a massive investment bank. And they found an open port running a misconfigured web server. So web server, that's what you need to access to see a website. And remember, that runs on port 80. So I mean, that's something that you should probably try to secure. And also the server lacked two-factor authentication. And that's basically the thing where, like, you know, when you try to log into a website, it also asks you to like confirm your identity on the phone. And so these hackers are able to make queries and enter the computer system through that port. So they're able to access JP Morgan's computer systems through port 80. And they were able to steal a bunch of data from their internal systems on over 80 million customers. So what they must have done is they could really use any tool. I mean, they could even get in their command line, and they could access this computer at this particular port. They could see whatever files are in there, and then really quickly use some software to zip them up and quickly transfer them to another server. And the breach was traced, but like, I mean, it's still going to be pretty embarrassing, because like, even if you're able to figure out how it happened, the fact that you let something that simple happen, yeah, I'm sure some people like got fired over that, or at least like just felt really bad about themselves. Now, just to kind of like solidify an understanding of what ports are. So right here, let's say that we want to access a website, and the data for the website is located on a server that you own. Now that server has an IP address, but to actually access that website, this is not what we would type in, because it's like if you're in a web browser, then you're going to port 80. Like, web browsers are meant to go to port 80, but that's essentially what the query, that's essentially what the kind of request you make in order to get access to the web server. Now, if you have an email application, right, and you want to get emails from an email server, then you're going to have a different port address. So it might be, actually, I don't know what it is, maybe like 555. I can't really remember. Because, you know, you can have email servers that host emails, that receive emails, and you may have an application that shows those. Same thing with getting files off an FTP server. The thing is, these are all services, and these services are held in a server, which has an IP address. And to access different servers, you need to access them at a different port. So again, a port is kind of like a TV channel, except for servers. There are a bunch of different port numbers, just like there are a bunch of different TV channels, and they each give you something different. Now, one thing that is not in the case study, but I think it's kind of implied that like this is something we should be talking about, is how you prevent these particular attacks. Because especially later on, we talk about response plans. So I think it's worth having a discussion about how to prevent attacks, like, for example, port scanning. So here are a few ways we can prevent port scanning attacks. First, we can block ports we're not using. So for example, if we're not using a port, 5001, then let's just not keep it open. And especially if we're not using a service, if there's a service that's open on that port that we don't need, let's just shut that down. Next, we can, through a firewall, or even through software, we can allow only trusted IP addresses to access our own server, or only a range of certain IP addresses, and those may be IP addresses or private IP addresses that are just on our network. And also, we can also configure our firewall to monitor any connections to make sure there's no behavior that's unusual, or block unauthorized attempts to connect to any port at all. So we can use basically, like, I think the most common approach would just be to use a firewall to restrict access to certain ports and certain IP addresses, and then make sure that there's no ports running, especially no open ports, that correspond to services that we don't need. And the next tool we can use is something called an OS detector, and we can use OS detection. This allows us to identify the operating system of a device that's running on a network. And basically, I mean, I'm not going to get too technical here because, again, the case study doesn't ask us to, but we can basically make a request to a particular server. And oftentimes we might need to use a specialized tool, but oftentimes it's pretty easy to get the operating system and version of that operating system back. And this helps us because, again, as I said, for pretty much any operating system, there are what are called exploits, and these are pieces of code or scripts you can run to gain access to a particular operating system or a particular piece of software, and often in an unauthorized way. And generally, when operating systems are upgraded, they are upgraded so that these pieces of code no longer work. But if you have an operating system that hasn't been upgraded for a while and it's old, there's probably something online, there's probably a toolkit online that someone can use to access your computer remotely, access your files, perhaps plant some malware, etc. So understanding the operating system, understanding the version of that operating system is key to understanding whether we'll have the possibility to infiltrate a particular computer system, a particular server on a network, really, or a group of servers, assuming they all have the same operating system, or operating systems for which we can find an exploit, for we can find some code to get into those. And just furthermore, like, why is knowing a target's OS useful? So as we said before, every operating system has its own strengths and weaknesses in terms of security. So we can identify those if we know what the operating system is and what the version is. We already talked about this. There's specific toolkits for specific operating systems that allow us to introduce malware or infiltrate the system in some way. And we can basically tailor our whole approach to entering a computer system or set of computer systems once we know what their OS is and what version it is. Now, next we're going to talk about a specific tool called an I would say, action or method called IP address cataloging. And again, I think this just falls under network scanning. But basically, this is a tool that allows us to find all of the IP addresses of all the devices on a particular network. And this may not just be servers or computers, but it could be routers. Because remember, a router is going to have an IP address, and then all the computers connected to that router will have their own private IP addresses. And then IoT devices, so those devices that are connected to the internet, like in the case of our case study, medical devices, or just in other contexts, for example, your smart refrigerator, or like, I don't know, your smart thermostat or whatever it is. So using IP address cataloging, we can find out all the IP addresses that are on a particular network. And I think by now it should be fairly obvious like why that's useful, because once we have an IP address, we can start scanning those IP addresses to find open ports, to perhaps get some more details like the identity of the particular device that's corresponding to that IP address. If it's a computer, we can also see what services are running on that. We can possibly see what services are running on the device at that IP address, etc. So like this is actually a really fundamental tool in order to allow us to build sort of a target map to understand, okay, where can we go and start looking for vulnerabilities. Now for a fun one. So I gotta say, like, these are all, I mean, just hacking in general is pretty interesting. These are all cool, but like, this is kind of my favorite. I know that probably sounds really bad, but like, well, you don't know what it is yet, but once you find out, it'll sound really bad. But basically, social engineering reconnaissance. And this is basically just like manipulating people into giving you information. And I like this because it's just simple. Like, I admire simple solutions to complex technical problems. And it's like, you could go through all the trouble of using like a password cracking tool, doing all this network analysis, network topology mapping to try to gain access to a particular computer system, or you could just convince someone to give you the password. And that's what social engineering reconnaissance is. Basically here, we're gathering information on people, and we're exploiting human vulnerabilities, or basically the human element. And this can take a variety of forms, right? So this can be by finding information, open source information about someone online. We can find out the names of, for example, the IT staff or people who interact with computer systems on a daily basis, roles, their habits, and communication patterns. So even let's say if there's a nurse who's working at this hospital, what is MTPH? It's in this case study. I don't know. She has like a bunch of gambling debts, or I mean, I guess it wouldn't be that easy to find that online. But maybe like she makes a post on Instagram about how she's like $100,000 in debt, and like how she's like working really hard at her job to try to make things happen and pay off that debt. Honestly, we could probably just send her a message and just be like, hey, here's 10 grand. I just want access to your computer. Or honestly, here's like $500. Can I just get access? Can I get this password and username? And that might just work. Now, I'm not being sexist. I'm not saying it's just a woman. Let's just say like any person, right? Anyone could be vulnerable to that. But the point is, by finding information out about people, you can find different ways to target your attacks. And you gain an important source of information on a computer system, including something as important as login credentials, right? And so basically social engineering reconnaissance is a set of methods that are used to collect information on a computer system. And this can be done by crafting convincing phishing, vishing, or pretexting attacks. And we'll go into what those are here in a second. Now, vishing, or voice phishing, okay. So basically like phishing attacks are, when you get an email, and they can take a variety of forms. It could be like something where you click on a link, and then that link gets you to enter like your bank account number or something like that if you're that stupid. But honestly, sometimes old people fall for this because like a lot of them aren't as like technologically adept. Although there are some old people that are pretty good with technology too. But anyways, you get the idea. So voice phishing is when you call up a person and you kind of trick them into revealing sensitive information. So the way you might do that is pretend to be like IT support, or you might pretend to be some kind of trusted figure. Like in the context of a hospital, the way this could work is you could call someone who works at the hospital and pretend to be from IT support. Odds are, if it's a big hospital, we don't really get that much information about how big this hospital is. But if it's big, like you may not even know like the names of your IT staff, right? So you might just call up an employee and just be like, hey, like I'm the head of the IT staff, and I need you to give me your password for X reason, like whatever. And you probably already have their email address as well, or login credentials. That might actually just be available online. And that's voice phishing, right? So you can get their login credentials, and once you get their login credentials, then you have access to probably, if it's like, for example, a nurse or a doctor, then you probably have access to a bunch of different patient medical records. And if you get access to multiple people's accounts, then that basically increases the amount of information that you have access to, particularly if they're like in different departments. So that's voice phishing. Now I'll give you a real example. I mean, there's a bunch of these, and some of them are actually freaking brilliant. So one example is in 2020, Twitter employees were targeted by attackers who pretended to be internal IT staff. And let's be honest, like a lot of IT people, first of all, they're really not that socially adept. And so if you're just like a random person working at a company, even if you talked to that person before, you probably forgot them in like 5 seconds, which not that great for IT staff, but for someone conducting a phishing attack or a vishing attack, that's pretty great. Anyways, so Twitter is attacked. So people call up different employees pretending to be internal IT staff. They basically trick them into giving up their login credentials and 2-factor authentication codes. So basically they're able to access internal admin tools, and so administrative tools, right? So these are software tools that are only accessible to employees and can be used to change perhaps different accounts or different aspects of the Twitter platform. They're able to take control of several high-profile Twitter accounts, including those of Elon Musk, Barack Obama, and Apple. And they're able to post fake Bitcoin giveaways that would allow users to send a bit of cryptocurrency and promise to give them double that amount in return. And obviously, this Bitcoin giveaway was bullshit because presumably, like, someone would send $500 worth of Bitcoin and then they just never get anything back. And the person running the scam, like, would go straight to their Bitcoin wallet, which is untraceable. So this is a great example of a vishing attack. There's some other ones as well. Like, I think it was like, there was one where some guy from like Lithuania like called up Microsoft and told them that they owed money for some kind of like software service bill. And it wasn't that much money to Microsoft, but I mean, it was a lot of money. I think this guy ended up making like $10 million off of this. But basically he said, oh, I'm from this software platform and you owe me money. And like, they just paid it because like, it wasn't that much to them. But he kept doing this. So over time, he was amassing more and more money and eventually got caught. But that's another example of a simple vishing attack that was able to work even when it was targeting a very technical company, a company with very high level of technical talent, right? Now, another social media reconnaissance tool is pretexting. So this is basically where you make up a story to trick someone into giving up confidential information. So if you've ever heard of the Nigerian print scam, like that's basically pretexting, right? Or if you've ever like, some kind of scam where someone needs money for like cancer treatment, but they don't have cancer and they're actually like a 50-year-old guy in Moldova, then that is another example of pretexting. Sorry, I mean like nothing against Moldova, but let's be honest. Anyways, the whole idea behind this is that you're using some sort of scenario in order to establish trust, right? And this is usually while you are pretending to be a trusted figure. So that could be HR staff, IT staff, etc. This doesn't necessarily have to be done over phone. This could be done through an email or some other method of communication. And it's basically doing the same thing as the previous method we talked about. The only difference is here we're giving someone a pretext, right? So we're giving them a situation that makes them more amenable to giving us what we want, which are usually things like login credentials, personal records, or access to restricted parts of a computer system. Now, here's a great example of pretexting. So in 2016, a hacker impersonated a CEO of a UK-based company by sending an email to a finance employee. And basically this hacker said there was a company acquisition that was going on that was secret. So he was basically implying that only, he was pretending to be the CEO of a company that someone worked at, right? So someone's working at this UK-based company, they're a finance employee, and all of a sudden they get a phone call from someone who they think is the CEO. And the CEO is probably being like pretty convincing and saying that the company is going to buy another company. And so this finance employee needs to urgently send money to a particular account. Perhaps this person was even like creating a sense of urgency by being super angry or being like or just kind of creating an aura or creating, basically maybe communicating an attitude of urgency, right? So this person, they don't want to lose their job. They're like, oh man, I really need to get this done as quickly as possible. This is the CEO. They transferred £200,000 to the attacker's account. Now, this is perhaps easier said than done, but there are ways to prevent social engineering reconnaissance attacks. First, provide regular employee training. So usually at any given point in time, there's certain types of social media or social engineering that is in vogue, right? That a lot of people are using. And so just providing like quick training on how to recognize these attacks and what's going on could be a useful situation. Or there could be multi-factor authentication so that even if you give someone your password, then when they try to log in, like you can still control that using, your other factor, which could be your phone or whatever it is. Also clear verification procedures. So we talked about how in that company in the UK, the CEO just called up and said, hey, you need to send £200,000 here, or like someone posing the CEO. So for those types of situations, you might have some sort of protocol where the finance employee has to ask the CEO special password, or there needs to be some sort of information that's confirmed between them before that person can send wire transfers or conduct other actions that are integral to the health of the company. Anyways, that brings us to our next section, our next phase, which is threat modeling. Okay, so now let's take a look at the next phase, which is going to be threat modeling. This is phase 3 in our PTS process, PTES process. So we're right here. We've already taken a look at the pre-engagement directions, which is essentially that discussion between the hospital and between the security agency. We've gone into intelligence gathering, which is basically gaining some preliminary knowledge on the computer system that penetration testers are targeting. And now we're going to look at threat modeling. Basically in this process, we're basically trying to analyze the system in order to figure out which parts of the system are going to be the most important and that we need to be focusing our testing efforts on. So we're pinpointing what systems, data, or processes are most critical to the organization, because these are the ones that we're going to need to assess for their vulnerability to attack. We're also going to consider who might attack. So we're taking our most valuable assets and considering who might attack these particular assets. This could be hackers, these could be disgruntled employees, these could be any number of people depending on the type of organization that we're performing penetration testing on. But in the case of a hospital, it's probably either going to be hackers, IT staff, or someone otherwise connected to the hospital. And then we're going to kind of create a list of priorities, right? So we're going to prioritize which systems are the most important and probably are most at risk. And then we're going to focus our testing on those higher priority items. So we're going to try to decide which particular parts of the system are most vulnerable or most important, and that we should be focusing our testing efforts on. So this is actually taken from the case study itself. And it's kind of a rehash, but I thought it was worth going through. Kind of already talked about identifying potential adversaries. One thing that we didn't talk about was assessing hacker capabilities and intentions. So in addition to assessing, okay, who might be going after this data or who might just try to shut down our systems, we also want to try to figure out how capable are the people that would be coming after these systems. Because that'll kind of give us a clue it'll mainly give the testing team, the cyber health security team, insight into how they should be testing these particular systems, right? So if we think a system is going to come under attack from a teenager at the local school, then the way that we test systems and the way that we kind of assess them for their vulnerability is going to be different than if we think a professional multinational hacking organization is going to be trying to hack into the computer system of the hospital. So in addition, we're going to be looking at the specific methods of exploitation. So and this kind of goes to as considering how these are going to be attacked, but in a more specific way. So are there going to be tactics like malware deployment, social engineering attacks, or network attacks? So we're looking at we've looked at who's going to attack, or we've talked about who's going to attack, we've talked about what their abilities are, and then we're going to try to predict some more specific tactics they might use. And this we already covered before, which is basically just creating a list of priorities and trying to focus our efforts, or trying to assess which parts of the system we should focus our efforts on as a penetration testing team. So I want to talk about some of these tactics, because I don't think they were super obvious as to what those meant. So the first tactic we might consider to be a possible threat during this particular phase, we might consider possibility as to whether our potential adversaries could deploy this, is malware deployment. And this is essentially using things like viruses, ransomware, or spyware to get access to a system or network. So a virus is a program that can be downloaded, that can enter into our system, and that can create vulnerabilities that allow a hacker to access it. Spyware could keep track of what a user on a computer is doing and then potentially make use of this information to attack the target. And ransomware may be shutting down a computer and refusing to unlock it until someone transfers you 1,000 Bitcoin. Now, this malware could be deployed using a variety of methods, including phishing emails, affected websites, or just USB drives, perhaps plugged into the system by an insider. Once deployed, we can kind of do a number of things, as we talked about: steal data, disrupt operations, or give remote access, which this one is probably going to be, this could potentially be the most damaging threat, right? Because this allows a bad actor to enter in and pretty much do whatever they want, which could be not only stealing data and disrupting operations, but then perhaps permanently damaging the equipment or any number of other things. And next, we've already kind of talked about social engineering attacks, but this is another vector to consider. And it's important to consider whether the hackers that might enter our system are going to be capable of this. And this involves manipulating people to give away confidential information. So previously, we talked about methods like vishing or pretexting, and these come under social engineering attacks. Those can be both ways to gain information on a potential target, but also then to help actually perform an attack. And these essentially allow us to bypass technical defenses by targeting humans, instead of trying to target the actual systems themselves. So instead of trying to decrypt a password or perform an attack that allows a computer program to guess the password, we're just going to ask a person or just get a person to give up that information. And finally, network attacks. And I think these are kind of what people, particularly technical people, envision the most when they think about hackers or how they would enter a system. These involve targeting the actual IT infrastructure. So for example, using a denial of a service attack to flood a system with so much traffic that it ends up shutting down. Could be intercepting data that's being transferred within the network or between the network and the internet or another system. or eavesdropping on unencrypted traffic in order to get access to passwords or any other data that's being transferred. So this is primarily focusing on network protocols, devices, or configurations to gain access to a system or to somehow harm that system. And again, this is the most technical, right? This is where we're directly trying to attack those network devices that build up that network. Now, once we've kind of gone through this process of figuring out who's going to attack the system and how, and this is usually going to be a collaboration between the security team and between the team that is being targeted, the team of the organization is being targeted, which in this case is the hospital, we're going to perform a vulnerability analysis. Now, this is identifying like specific security flaws, so not just identifying specific areas that we want to focus on, but actual just problems, pre-existing problems that are in the network that could pose a threat to the security of a system. So we've done our pre-engagement interactions, our intelligence gathering and threat modeling, and now we're doing vulnerability analysis. And oftentimes this is going to be, actually this is part of the 7-step process. So really this is going to be a precursor to the exploitation phase where we actually try to enter the system and see what happens, right? Where we're actually going to hack into the system in order to simulate what an actual penetration or an actual cyber attack would look like on that particular system. So the vulnerability analysis, we're kind of finding the weaknesses of a system, and then we're going to use these weaknesses eventually to guide our cyber attack on the system. So we're not only looking at the flaws, we're assessing the severity and potential impact of each flaw, and then we're eventually going to use what we found here to help an organization focus on securing and best securing their system. So we're scanning for vulnerabilities, often using automated tools. We could manually be examining the system itself just by having someone on the security team just go in the command line and try to access different parts of the system or potentially gain access to different parts of the system. We're going to identify the specific weaknesses based on the usage of these tools, and then prioritize which ones are the most critical and which ones could be the most damaging to the hospital itself. And again, this could both be for the hospital, but also to guide the next phase, which is the exploitation phase. Now, just to kind of go into a bit more detail, there are certain tools that can be used to scan for vulnerabilities. And oftentimes they're kind of just umbrella vulnerability scanners that might scan for unpatched software, outdated systems, and known security flaws, especially as a result of outdated systems. They could also check for things like weak passwords or disabled firewalls in the existing security software, and also track any missing updates and system changes. So these missing updates and outdated software can be really important because oftentimes software is updated in order to protect against a newer emerging threat to that particular piece of software. So a new piece of code that's been released that could allow someone else to gain access to the software program that you're using on your computer and therefore your computer, right? So that's why updating your software is so important, and making sure that everything is up to date and your software is patched is incredibly important, because if it's not, then there might be some threat that didn't exist before that can be used to gain remote access to your system, damage your system, steal your data, etc. This is basically, trying to determine which computers in a network are at risk and how much at risk they are. Right here, we might also have different pieces of software that are being analyzed in their own right to determine, what the severity of risk is to them. We talked about manual examination before, and this really involves kind of just going into the system itself and seeing what weaknesses there are in the code and what weaknesses there are in the way the system is structured that would leave it vulnerable. So this could involve manually inspecting source code or system settings, and looking for example, there might be a password left in the code itself that can be used, or there might be certain errors in code in a program that's being used to secure a system that would allow the user to easily bypass it and gain access to the system. Or there might be easy ways for attackers to give themselves more access than they should normally have. So this is kind of really just more getting into the weeds and getting into the system itself and trying to figure out what the vulnerabilities are, rather than just using an external testing tool like the automation testing tool we just looked at before. So once we've kind of assessed these vulnerabilities using our different tools and then prioritize them, we're going to move on to the exploitation phase, which is where this actual simulated cyber attack is going to happen. Okay, so now right here we're at phase 5. It's 2 phases away from the end, and we've essentially decided what the simulated cyber attack is going to look like. We've gathered information to help the team actually perform a cyber attack as if they were an actual attacker. We've tried to predict who's going to attack, what their capabilities are, and what we should prioritize for protecting from them. And then we've tried to find actual vulnerabilities, both to inform the hospital, or both to inform the target, and then also to allow us to perform exploitation more efficiently. So this is the phase where testers actually get to do their thing. So they actually try to hack into the system to gain unauthorized access, control, or data from the target system. And this is where they're actually determining what their possible real-world cyber attack could look like. So they're going to try to access sensitive files, bypass authentication, or try to get more privileges than any normal user in the system should have. Now, all these actions are controlled to both meet ethical standards and to stay within the rules of engagement that were agreed upon in the pre-engagement interactions. And this includes usually includes not causing damage to data, to critical data, and additionally documenting everything so that the cyber attack isn't performed just to attack the system, but can eventually then be used to actually improve the security of the system. So to kind of go into a bit more depth, this is actually again from the case study. There's going to be targeted breaching attempts, or breaching attempts are essentially attempts to breach or enter the hospital systems. A part of this is going to be exploit development. Exploit development is the crafting of custom scripts or tools to actually take advantage of the vulnerabilities that we would have identified previously, both during our intelligence gathering phase and during our vulnerability assessment in the previous phase. And I've kind of referred to exploits before, but these are going to be custom pieces of code that can be used to gain access to a specific system or to a specific piece of software. And these might either be crafted by the team itself, or they might be bought off the darknet. And then ultimately, when we perform this actual exploitation, we're going to be using a variety of tools that we're going to go into, a variety of techniques rather. These include SQL injection, cross-site scripting, buffer overflow attacks, and password cracking tools. And once we've done all of this, then in subsequent phases, the team is going to actually assess and communicate what damage could be done and what vulnerabilities were and what access was achieved through this simulated cyber attack. So we're going to be going through the different possible techniques that could be used in order to complete this simulated cyber attack. In order to do that, we're going to have to get some basic understanding of how computer systems work. That's why first, what I want to do is I want to go over how web applications work, because some of the techniques involve taking advantage of a particular system's public-facing website. So basically how web applications work is someone tries to access a website. So it could be mtph.com/login, for example, right? So someone goes into their web browser, which is right here, and that could be Google Chrome, and they make an HTTP request to a web server. And they make that request by putting this address that corresponds to the IP address that is in front of the server. So either it's at the router that's in front that the server is connected to, or in absolute worst case, the server itself. So it's going to go to an IP address. It's like 112. Let's say, I'm just making this up, 7.7.1. That's going to be either the web server's address or the router that's in front of the web server. What's important to know is this web server is going to be inside that IT infrastructure that we're talking about. So this web server is going to live inside the computer systems that the penetration testing team is trying to protect and is also trying to attack in order to identify what the vulnerabilities are. So basically, any random person can go on the internet and they can access the website, the public-facing side of that organization's IT systems, like so, right? And when they do that, then the web server is going to return some HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. Or the web server there might be some additional functionality. So for example, if someone's submitting a form, then that form data might be handled by PHP or Python or some other code that's written in this language that will generate a response that's sent back to your web browser and that's displayed in Google Chrome or whatever browser you're using. That's essentially how a web application works. If you want more details or you want a broader explanation, I can include a link in the description, and that's a link from my Option C video where I kind of spend a lot more time discussing what web applications are. But that's basically the gist of it. Someone accesses a web server through their browser, they type in an address, and they submit an HTTP request to web server. And that web server is living inside the computer systems of, for example, the hospital. And that web server returns some information, or it processes information and then returns the result, which is then displayed in the web browser of the person who accessed it. Now, by understanding this, we can get an idea of how some relatively simple cyber attacks work. And let's go ahead and let's take a look at that. So server-side scripting, that's just the idea of a programming language handling data that's submitted by the browser and then returning some response. Anyways, the first type of web attack that can happen through a web application or through a web server is going to be SQL injection. And so SQL is essentially a language that is used to manipulate a database. And a database is where we store information. So for example, patient records or user information. And that database is going to be, that's just basically a structured file. It's basically a file system that's going to sit on this web server right here. And when we submit a request, like if we try to log in or if we try to submit information, that's usually going to trigger some change in the database to either store that information or check whether, for example, that password and user information is valid. So it already exists in the database on the web server. So essentially the database serves as our storage for things like users, user passwords, and patient data. And we can manipulate the information in the database, add information, delete information, change information using SQL. But if we don't write our code in the right way, so the idea behind SQL is that we will take commands written in SQL, and those will be part of our code. That our code written in Python or PHP that sits on our web server, right? So really that SQL should only be executable by our own code or by an admin or by an administrator that has access to the database and to the web server. However, if the code for our website or web application is incorrectly written, then that means that the user could submit information, could submit their own SQL that makes changes to the database. And that is essentially a SQL injection attack. So for example, right here, if the code is written in such a way that allows the username to actually be executed as a SQL command, and I'll show you how that works in a second, then someone could submit a drop users command, which basically deletes all of the users that are registered for the system. And that could seriously damage the capability of the system. And usually this happens when user input isn't properly validated. So validation is making sure that, for example, username only contains, for example, letters and numbers and not any string symbols. But if there's no validation to make sure that what we're inputting is what we want our system to be taking in, then someone could submit SQL, and that could possibly change or give the user access information they shouldn't otherwise have. So they could view, modify, or delete data or bypass login systems to get access to, for example, patient data, which should be private and which should absolutely not be available to the public. Now I'm going to go through a quick example right here, and this is actually what we saw on the other page. So let's say that the user puts some input into the username field right here. So normally it'd be John Doe, but maybe they put in John Doe, they have a exclamation point, and then the next line is going to be drop users, followed by a double dash. Now that double dash is important because any other SQL code that comes after this that may be part of the web application, or that may be input that may be inserted by our own web application, by our own code sitting in our web servers that has our website, it makes sure that doesn't work and only the command that has been entered works. That's drop users, right? And so just based on the way the code is written, this is what we might get, or rather this is what we might have, right? So this might be the query where we want to get some user where the username is whatever is in here and whatever is in here. Right here, input and input are just examples. But then when we have this command, it becomes this, right? So we might get a user, we might try to get a user where the username is equal to John Doe, but then also we're going to have drop users, right? So this is going to become part of that SQL command because it's taking the place of basically our username, where we would have had username input and we just had the username. Because the user inputted drop users, that's going to become part of our SQL command. And that basically tells the database to delete all of the users that are in the database. Now, it's not essential to understand the SQL, although again, if the SQL doesn't make sense, then I'll put a link to option A, which is on databases. But really, all you really need to understand is that this is basically a situation in which the user is able to input some SQL statements into the system, and these cause undesired behavior. That's really the main thing you need to understand. This is just an example to kind of make that clear. So we have, this is what the ordinary behavior is. This is what our SQL should look like. Select from users, so get users where the username equals whatever is in this field and the password equals whatever in this field. But because we have code right here, we're replacing this part right here with this part right here with something that contains drop users, which is then going to get executed. And instead of just getting us all the users that have this username input and password input, which really we would have wanted username John Doe and password input. We're going to delete the entire database. Now, there's some ways to prevent SQL injection attacks. We already talked about validating data and perhaps sanitizing all user input. So getting rid of so basically disallowing the user to input any symbols that might correspond to SQL. We can also limit database permissions so that only certain users, there's only certain contexts in which the database can be accessed. So maybe an admin can really make certain changes to a database, and the application can only make certain changes. Because the application is really going to be it's going to be corresponding to a user role as well. But the point is we're going to restrict roles. So we're going to restrict what or who can make changes to the database. So that, for example, when we input this type of drop users command, the web application just wouldn't be able to execute that. And additionally, we can basically structure our queries just to not make things like this possible, right? So make sure that the SQL queries that we have in our code are very specific and are structured in a way to not allow for SQL injection attacks. So basically, to summarize with SQL injection, this is where someone tries to access the login page of a particular system they're targeting. And instead of just inputting regular text, they input SQL commands. And the SQL commands get introduced to SQL that is already going to be executed when, for example, someone logs into a website and they perform undesired behavior, like in this case, for example, deleting all the users. The next type of attack is going to be cross-site scripting. And this is going to be a similar sort of attack in the sense that we're not actually injecting SQL to the login page, but we're actually injecting JavaScript. And this is particularly true when we have a website that allows us to input information that's going to be then displayed on the website again. So for example, like comments are a great example, right? Because we can submit a comment, and then that comment that we submitted is going to be shown on the page again. The idea behind cross-site scripting is instead of just submitting text, we can submit some JavaScript that might initiate an ad on that page when it's displayed as a comment. Because that comment is going to take whatever text we put in, and if it's not properly secured, it could execute it. So it's going to show it as HTML, but could also execute any JavaScript there, right? So the idea is that cross-site scripting is something that happens when we have a website where we can type in some text that's going to be shown on the website itself, like for example, the comment section. And when someone, instead of just typing in text, they type in JavaScript. So then when that text they submitted is being displayed on the comment side, then the JavaScript that was included as part of that text is going to end up being executed, and that could lead to some behavior that we don't want to happen. So it can allow attackers to steal cookies, which might have that user's information, session tokens to allow them to access that login session. It could allow an attacker to capture keystrokes, so whatever the user's typed in, redirect users to ads or something else, or use these methods to somehow impersonate them, right? So usually the way this happens is when we have a website that accepts user input, but it doesn't get rid of certain tags, like for example, script tags that would be used to denote JavaScript on an HTML page. So on any page, if you have like script, then that allows you to have JavaScript. And actually, like, if it wasn't clear, JavaScript is a programming language where code can be executed inside the browser. So it's not being sent back to the web server, but can be executed inside the browser in order to, for example, generate an ad, or when you click a button to allow some immediate reaction, or for example, when you type something into an input to allow some sort of immediate feedback. Any application you use that has anything real time, that's going to be done through JavaScript. So it's really something where we can tell the browser, meaning Chrome, to do certain things. So again, I'm going to include a link because I explain all of this in different videos, but if you don't really have a good handle on what JavaScript is or how web applications work, I'm going to include some links in the description so you can get access to those because I've explained all of these in the past. Anyway, so the idea is that the user input is not properly sanitized. So once we submit input from the user, we allow script tags like this to be displayed later, and for example, as a comment or as some sort of post, which indicates JavaScript, which would allow any JavaScript here to be introduced. Then that can lead to a cross-site scripting attack. So we want to make sure that that whenever someone submits some kind of input like this, we make sure there's none of these tags, and if they're there in that input, then we get rid of them. And this is usually going to happen on the server side in our web application. Or it could happen in the browser as well in our own JavaScript, right, that we're writing for our website. Now here's just like a simple example. So we have a comment form on a blog, and someone submits this, right? And the blog just displays this because they haven't really sanitized it. And this basically creates, so basically allows it basically allows some website that's at this server to get access to a cookie. Or it may not necessarily be at this server, but basically the script is allowing someone to send a user session cookie, which might have their information about their current login, would allow someone else to log in as this person or impersonate them. And that information is going to be sent to the attacker's server, which actually I think would be evil.com/steal. Like I'm pretty sure that's how this would work. Anyways, the point is this is being executed when it shouldn't be, because this has been submitted as a comment. And then because of that, the cookie for the current website, and a cookie is just a piece of information that's stored in the browser. Oftentimes this is used to show that someone's logged in, right? So for example, when you log into a particular website, your log information is going to be stored as a cookie. Whenever you navigate to different pages, the website's going to make sure that the cookie is there to give you a more personalized experience and to make sure that you're still going to be logged in when you go to different sites on the website. But anyways, that information could be hijacked this way and sent to someone else, so then they have access to your login information or to that session itself, meaning that they can actually log in, or they can basically take over that period or that situation, that context in which you've already logged in. So basically they can pretend that they're logged in as you. Now we kind of talked a little bit about this, about sanitizing, and basically you want to prevent certain characters like the script tag from being able to be used. Also, we could use something called a content security policy to prevent an XSS attack. This limits what scripts can run in a browser. So for example, we might only allow certain types of JavaScript to do certain things to run, or we might not allow JavaScript at all, depending on the structure of our web page. And basically everywhere, whenever we accept inputs, for example, if you accept a comment, we might want to check on the client side, so check in the web browser using our own website's code to make sure that that input, so that text doesn't contain any JavaScript or anything that might allow for a cross-script site attack. And remember, if we submit a comment, that's probably going to go back to our web server to be stored and then displayed on our web page. So also on our web server where we have like PHP or Python, you can also check there to make sure that we don't have any JavaScript or any such code that would allow for a cross-site scripting attack. Okay, now let's talk about what a buffer overflow attack is. And to be honest, I might have made this seem a little more complicated than it actually is with all this text and these diagrams. But basically what it is when you have a certain amount of memory that's allocated to a certain type of data that's been input into your program and consequently into your web server, right? Like a web server is essentially a computer, but let's say that you have a web application and that accepts, again, comments, like in the previous website or web application we talked about. Now, for each comment, there may be like 1 byte of data or 2 bytes of data that are allocated to that particular comment, right? So to be honest, I can't remember off the top of my head how many characters that would be, but let's say that you can have a maximum, you have enough memory allocated to that comment that's equivalent to like 20 characters, all right? And this is not something you usually do in Python because Python kind of automatically gives you as much memory as you need, but particularly in languages like C or C++, you like specifically specify, like you specifically say like, this amount of data is going to take up this much space. It's going to take up this much space. But basically what a buffer overflow attack is when someone is able to input data that takes up more space than was allocated for that particular type of data. So let's say that you've basically, in your code, you've written that a single comment takes up 2 bytes of data. But someone's able to input more than 2 bytes of data. And that takes up memory, and not only in that particular, so that takes up more than 2 bytes of data in a particular location. So that 2 bytes might be at a particular spot in memory, but now because you have more than 2 bytes of data that's supposed to be stored there, it's taking up data in the space that's next to those 2 bytes. So more than it should be. And in that space that's next to those 2 bytes that were allocated, there might be something really important, right? So there might be some code that should be stored there. There might be any number of things that could be stored in memory, right? So different types of commands, different types of data that maybe should have been stored there, but that's being overwritten now. And that's a buffer overflow attack. That's when someone is able to input more data at a particular location that should be there, and it overwrites other data as a result, which can cause a program to not work correctly. As a result, a web application not function correctly, and maybe a website to not be displayed or to behave in a way that it shouldn't be behaving. So again, right here, you might have some code that should be stored in these spots, or you might have something that should be stored in these spots right here, but then instead of just taking up these spots, it takes up all of this right here. And this is actually probably an easier example where you only have enough memory to store this, but all of this is being stored. I actually don't really like that function example too much. It's kind of a bit too complicated. But in addition to just erasing that code, what could happen is in these extra spots right here, right? So in the areas that weren't allocated, let's say, you could have some malicious code. So you could have a virus, you could have some kind of code that deletes other code that basically prevents your system from functioning the way it should. I think this is probably like the simplest example, where you have like 8 bytes allocated, but then through a buffer overflow attack, you're taking up an additional 6 bytes next to it, and that is basically deleting whatever information there gets deleted. So just to kind of go into more detail, and this is kind of like a rehash and go into more detail, program allocates a fixed size buffer, right? And I think I was kind of talking about memory before as if it was just RAM. If we're talking about a buffer, we're usually talking about some intermediary storage before something goes into RAM or before something's getting sent to another place. But basically, it's a temporary intermediary storage area, right, for data that's going to be used and that's going to be executed. So this sort of overflow attack that we talked about is going to be happening in a buffer, and these buffers exist in the CPO. Oftentimes, there are multiple buffers, right? So again, I want to be clear when we're talking about memory, we're not necessarily talking about RAM. We're talking about buffers, which are temporary storage. But still, I mean, you're still going to have the same impact because that's in a buffer. Then that extra code could end up in our RAM, and if there's malicious code, that can end up in our RAM as well. So basically, we write a program in C or C++, which allows us to manipulate memory, and that program is going to be our web application. It's going to be running on our web server. And we allocate 64 bytes to store some user input. An attacker enters more data. That overflows into the memory spaces next to what was allocated, and that overwrites important data. But there could also be malicious code that causes the web application to jump and execute a different set of code that may give an attacker control over the system, or might just delete other code in the system, etc. So we're in a buffer, we're in this memory storage area, we're taking over space that we shouldn't, and perhaps we're even inserting code in there that shouldn't be in our system. And by we, I mean an attacker is doing that. Now, the best way to prevent this would be to make sure that your program validates and checks the amount of data that's actually been taken into the web location of the program before it is actually sent to memory, right? Before it's stored in memory. So this could be done on the client side, where we check, okay, like how large is this text, or how large is this user input? How many bytes is it? Or it could be done before it actually gets stored in a buffer or stored in memory. And this is a little bit more complicated. I'd probably do this on the client side with JavaScript or something like that. But the point is you'd have code that validates the input, similar to all the other previous attacks, to make sure that it's the appropriate size for the space that's been allocated to it. Now, the next type of tool we're going to have is something called a password cracking tool. And this is actually probably kind of the simplest, and this is actually what a lot of early hackers start with. Like, I used to be really interested in computer security and hacking back when I was probably 16. And this was like kind of the first type of tools I started with. I started out just like cracking Wi-Fi passwords. And it was easy because their programs will do this for you. And the way they work is they're designed to just guess passwords. So input as many combinations as possible until they get the correct one. And there are multiple different types. There's brute force, which literally just tries to guess every letter. There's dictionary attacks, which can try to target certain types of passwords or certain set of passwords. And rainbow tables, which is another way of password cracking. But the point of all of these is that these allow you to guess or to get a password could be to log into a system, to an online portal, or it could be to log into a system, to get into a system through a command line, and then do whatever it is that as an attacker you'd want to do within that system. Now, the last type of tool we're going to talk about is something we've talked about many times before, and this is an exploit. And this is a piece of code or method that takes advantage of a vulnerability or flaw in a software, hardware, or otherwise computer system. So it's basically just a piece of code that when executed, gives a hacker unauthorized access to a system, crashes the system, or maybe provides remote access to the system. And these can often just be downloaded off the internet or created by security experts or malicious hackers. And usually these need to be executed within the system itself or adjacent to the system to allow access to a particular piece of software, hardware, or any other network devices. Now here's an example of an exploit. So a web server has not been updated, so it has an unpatched vulnerability, right? And this allows file uploads without checking what's actually in the file. The attacker uploads a malicious PHP script, or it could be a Python script. So that this way we're basically altering the web application itself that accepts data on the web server from a user and then processes it. So an attacker uploads a PHP script, some code that's disguised as an image. This gives someone else remote access to the server, which they can then be used to steal data, install malware, etc. I'm not going to go through all of this because probably most of my viewers aren't going to be too familiar with PHP, but this is an example of a piece of PHP code that could do that. If you're doing option C, then this might be something you could easily kind of interpret. Now, the whole process of actually creating exploits is called exploit development. And there's a few different steps here, right? So usually what an attacker, a security researcher would want to do is they would want to analyze the source code of a particular program, or maybe the firmware software that's used to power a particular piece of hardware, to look for bugs, look for possible problems that could allow someone to get access to that particular device or software program, or to alter it in some way. And once they find that particular weakness, that problem, they can test and try to figure out what conditions trigger it and how it can be triggered to give unauthorized access or to allow some unauthorized change to be made to that piece of software or hardware. And once that's done, that particular trigger or the method of gaining access to that system or altering that system that takes advantage of a flaw in the programming of the software that corresponds to that software program itself, the software that corresponds to that hardware, that whole process is turned into code. The idea being that you can write some code and you can execute that code, which will then give you access to that particular software program or piece of hardware based on the weaknesses that you found before. So exploit development, you're kind of looking for a vulnerability in a system. You're understanding that vulnerability and then you're writing some code to allow you to take advantage of that vulnerability. And oftentimes, exploits are invented and figured out all the time. There have been some amazing exploits for Windows systems, for Microsoft Word, for Outlook. Most systems have some sort of output, some kind of exploit that's rapidly developed. But then the company that owns that piece of software will then release a patch in order to address that particular flaw, prevent that exploit from working. And one last term I want to go over is something called privilege escalation, which I'm not really sure that I really explained in that much depth. But this is basically the idea when an attacker gains higher access than intended. So oftentimes in any computer system, there's a hierarchy of access. So some users can make changes. Some users can only read the information or see the information system. Some users can read and access information. Some users can read, access, and delete information. So usually the admin account is going to be the one that has the most access, the administrator account. And what attackers will often try to do is once they get access to a system, they'll try to make themselves administrators. They have absolute control over everything in the system. It allows them, for example, to take data and transfer it to their own server, to delete data, etc. And this is an example of privilege escalation. Okay, so we've completed our exploitation, we've breached the system. So now it's time to kind of assess and take stock of what really was possible and what could have been possible subsequent to breaking into the system. So the post-exploitation stage is going to come obviously right after exploitation. That's going to be phase 6. So phase 6 out of 7. And here we focus on what an attacker could do. So based on what the security team was able to do or was able to get access to once they entered the system, we kind of try to assess in the post-exploitation phase exactly what would have been possible, right? Because the thing is when we break into a system as a security team just doing penetration testing, we're not going to actively steal, for example, patient data, but we know whether we could have or not, right? So this is more of an analysis phase, right? It's more of a phase in which the security team is really going to figure out how far they really could have gone in the system, what exactly they could have done for the benefit of the client, in this case, the hospital, because this will really give them a full understanding of just how vulnerable their systems are and how much they could be damaged in the case of a possible cyber attack. So we're focusing on what the attacker could do, and this could include things like stealing data, gaining access, or moving deeper into the network and getting access to different devices within the network itself. How possible things are like privilege escalation, data exfiltration. This is really kind of a repetition of this, right? So getting higher levels of access and getting data out. And really what we're trying to do is measure the potential for damage once someone is able to actually breach a system. And now, kind of going back to the case study right here, we're not just looking at whether we could get sensitive data out, but also the types of sensitive data that we could get out, whether it might just be patient records or it could be things like patient records and administrative data or other confidential information. We've already kind of discussed privilege escalation. We're looking at the potential for establishing persistence. And persistence means the ability for a hacker to continually maintain access to a network without a security team or IT team noticing that they have access. We're going to do an operational impact assessment, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And then we're going to engage in something called system forensics, which also we're going to talk about. But that's basically going into system logs, or going into the records that are kept by an IT system and figuring out to what extent, based on those records, we could actually detect an exploitation. So this is going in and seeing what traces that the security team left behind and what traces a potential real-life attacker might leave behind in the system that allow us to understand exactly what damage that they have done. So when we're talking about system forensics, think about like a crime scene. Think about a crime scene analysis. Think about like CSI, right? Going in and trying to figure out, okay, what traces have been left by the penetration testing, and then what traces might be left by a real life attacker. So I want to talk about a few of these concepts, one of them being persistence, right? And persistence is essentially this idea that you have persistent or you have continual access to a system even after you've actually completed the breach. So it's not just like you're hacking into the system once and then you're getting access to it, but you can continually do whatever you want to the system. This can be done by creating backdoor accounts. So possibly creating hidden accounts that the IT staff wouldn't be available or wouldn't be aware of, that have admin privileges that allow you to access and do anything to the data you want. Another way of establishing persistence could be installing malware. So installing a virus or installing some piece of software that allow for remote control of particular systems or all the systems in the network. And also modifying startup scripts. So modifying code that executes when a computer is turned on or when an operating system has been turned on to allow you to get access to a system regardless of whether it's turned off or not. So certain types of malware, certain types of software might be erased once a system's turned off. But if you have a piece of code that is scheduled to execute at intervals or that executes every time a computer turns on, this could be a way for you to get access regardless of the state of the system, right? This could be just a way for you to receive, or this could be a way for you to instruct the system to send you whatever new data is in the system every week or every month or every time the computer turns on. So it may not simply just be getting remote access, but also continually getting access to a pipeline of new data or new information about a system at regular intervals. Now, one thing that's going to be done as part of this phase is something called an operational impact assessment. And this is essentially going to be a document. This is a process that usually results in a document. The document's usually going to be in the next phase, which is actually the reporting phase. So this is an assessment. This is basically a process where we're determining how the breach affects critical systems. So things like emails, databases, patient care systems that are directly involved in providing care to patients on a real-time basis. To what extent could these have been disrupted in a potential cyber attack? What are the risks to data confidentiality, integrity, and availability? So data confidentiality is going to be how secret the data, whether that data could be kept secret, whether the identity of patients could be kept secret, whether that data can be readily accessible. So is it going to be corrupted? Could an attacker basically make it damage a database in some way so that we can't really access data? And availability. So could that data be deleted? Could that data be taken offline for a while? Like, what are the possibilities there? Then as part of this process, we would do an estimation of the overall business and safety impact. So how would this affect the operations of, for example, a hospital? What kind of monetary loss could we be looking at? What kind of legal consequences could we be looking at? And what would the dangers be to customer and patient safety? With, for example, patient safety being directly affected if medical devices that are connected to the internet in this whole Internet of Things scheme or paradigm that we talked about before is being used. So could someone hack into, like, for example, an insulin machine, increase the dose and kill someone? So that's really where patient safety could come into play. But it could also be something as simple as having their medical records erased, right? Because all of a sudden, if you don't have any records of treatment for patients, then you could be giving them something that they're allergic to or something that you shouldn't be giving them subsequent to previous treatment that they've received. So really, this operational impact assessment is a process by which you're going through, and you're basically doing these things right here. And this will eventually go into a report and will go into a set of information that's going to be reported to the client, which in this case would be the hospital. Next, system forensics. So system forensic basically involves analyzing digital traces left by during penetration testing. So this could be things like logs, and logs are basically just documents that contain data that's continually updated by any computer system. And that's usually data that involves changes that have happened in the system, potentially errors that have happened in the system, access to the system, etc. So these would be analyzed, any records of file changes or any just unusual processes, because usually you can see the different processes that have taken place over time in any computer system. We'd be doing this in order to identify how the system is accessed or manipulated and what vulnerabilities are exploited. And the ultimate goal of system forensics is to improve detection and response. So if we're doing system forensics after a security team has completed a simulated cyber attack on a system, then we'll get an idea of what specific changes are going to be recorded during a cyber attack. So how the logs are going to be changed, what files are going to be changed. And this means that we can be on the lookout for these particular changes on a more regular basis, so that if a real cyber attack takes place, then we can detect it quite quickly because we know what to look for, right? We've already got an idea of what we should be keeping track of based on the simulated cyber attack. So we can continually be looking for those things to make sure that a cyber attack in the real world hasn't taken place after this. Basically, we can improve our ability to detect and respond, and as a result of this, respond to potential cyber attacks by understanding what happens and what the system sees during a cyber attack, or what they saw based on what they saw during this penetration testing. Now, to kind of go into a bit more depth into what system logs are, because I think this is an important concept. These are just records that are automatically generated by operating systems, applications, or devices. So it's literally going to be a text file, and these are some examples right here. It's actually oftentimes a .log file, which is basically text. And they provide a timeline of events. So they're often recording exactly what's going to be happening. For example, in the Linux operating system, there's always going to be an auth.log file that shows failed login attempts. So you can see whether a hacker, for example, tried to use a password cracking tool to log into the system, because you would probably see like a couple of thousand failed login attempts in that log. Failed password. This is just an example of what an auth.log file would look like. This obviously isn't the only log. This isn't the only log file, but this is one of many that could give you hints as to whether a cyber attack has occurred and how the perpetrator attempted to execute that cyber attack on your system. Now, system configuration changes are important because configuration is essentially the settings of a file system. This could be things like the language, security settings, device settings. If you ever go to a settings window in Microsoft, I think it's called computer settings or something like that, that's really a part of system configuration. And we can track these by checking specific logs that correspond to system configurations. And in order to keep our system more secure, we can actually use tools that continually monitor these specific logs and that perhaps even alert us through like an online dashboard, or just give us an alert when some configurations have been changed that shouldn't be changed or that might correspond to a potential cyber attack. Additionally, these tools and these logs as well would keep a record of what's gone on in the system, so that we can kind of analyze, we can actually maybe find a pattern of behavior that potentially corresponds to a cyber attack and be alerted to that. Now, another part of this particular phase is going to be malware analysis. So we could be using certain types of malware to get access to a system. These could be viruses, because these could be Trojans that have been sent by email to a member of the IT staff to get access to a system. But if once this malware is introduced into the system, then we could go ahead and try to understand and analyze how that performed and how that affected the behavior of the system. And this can be useful for the security team to detect subsequent cyber attacks, because if you see a certain type of behavior, we might understand, okay, oh, that corresponds to this type of malware, and therefore there's something wrong with our system. Additionally, if the malware evaded detection, if, for example, the antivirus software in any of the computer systems or in the IT system as a whole didn't detect the malware, then we could update our systems and maybe try to get we could update our antivirus software or antivirus detection systems, and then we'll potentially add new systems to make sure that we're detecting all types of potential malware that would be introduced into our system. So we can study any malicious code that's been introduced to our system, identify what that does to our system, and then if it evaded detection, make sure that we update our antivirus or anti-malware protections in order to make sure that if we have a real cyber attack, that we're going to be able to immediately detect any malware and solve for the problems that malware causes in our system. And again, a lot of times, this type of analysis, for example, keeping track of system logs, there are automated tools out there that allow us to do this. So it may just be, so in terms of securing your system, what a security team might just do is they might take what they've learned from this type of penetration testing and then update the existing tools they have or add additional tools to account for the potential vulnerabilities that have been found in their system. So we've kind of gone through this phase of assessing after the initial breach into the system, what was possible, what could have been possible, and how the system changed during that cyber attack. But once we do that, we need to communicate with our client, similar to how at the very beginning of this process, we had to have a discussion with our client about what they wanted from this particular process. And that's going to be the reporting phase. So here we're mainly doing documentation. So we're documenting all the findings from a penetration test, including what vulnerabilities we discovered, how they were exploited, and what the potential impact could be on our system from an operations perspective, a financial perspective, a legal perspective, etc. Then we give recommendations for how to fix these issues. And these are just recommendations, right? So then it would be up to the hospital IT staff or the client to actually take these recommendations into account and then update their systems in response. And these reports are generally going to be tailored to both technical and non-technical audiences. And this is so that the technical audiences know from a technical perspective what they should do, and the non-technical audiences understand the real threat that their systems face and why they should be investing money or they should be investing time in helping to further secure their system. So this is taken from the case study, and basically with reporting, vulnerability and exploitation details, actionable recommendations, and something that's going to be part of this phase is also going to be a security posture assessment. This is an overall analysis, holistic analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the hospital's IT systems with regards to cybersecurity. Now, another thing that a cybersecurity firm might do is help their client develop a response plan to a potential cyber attack. And we're going to go through what that might look like. So generally, a response plan is going to have 3 stages. It's going to be incidence detection, response strategies, and recovery processes. So how are we going to actually detect a cyber attack? How would we respond to it? Like, what are some strategies we'd use to respond to that? And how could we recover from that attack? And this is generally going to be informed by the report that was generated in the reporting phase, because how we detect potential cyber attack, respond to it, and recover from it is going to be based on what our perceived threats are and what the strengths and weaknesses are based on that security posture assessment that we talked about in the case study and in the reporting phase. Now, there's some things to take into consideration when developing a response plan. So first of all, you want clear roles for the people in your team, right? So you want the people on your security team to all be responsible for certain things. Additionally, you want to be using reliable detection tools. So you want to make sure that you have good systems in place to detect threats early on, and this can be by looking at logs and monitoring system changes. So you need to make sure that there are clear roles in your team that are all focusing on different areas, that everyone is focusing their full attention on a specific area to get overall coverage of the system, and also have good tools for detecting any potential irregularities in the functions of the system. Next, you're going to want to have very fast response and recovery procedures, steps to contain threats like malware, and then quickly restore systems while communicating with key stakeholders. So you're going to communicate with the people that this will affect. Could be patients, could just be staff, but overall have a very fast procedure in place to respond to attacks and recover whatever necessary data is, or whatever necessary data or IT infrastructure that is important to the operations of the institution whose IT systems you're working with, in this case, the hospital. Finally, you want to make sure that your procedures are aligning with legal requirements, which could be important with regards, or are very relevant to patient data. And also, make sure to continuously be testing your systems and making sure that you're ready to deal with any potential cyber attacks. So there should be a continuous process in place, kind of like fire drills, right? To kind of maybe simulate an attack on your own or simulate some sort of regularity, and then make sure that everyone knows how to react. And that generally would involve regularly training staff, not just IT staff, but also regular staff that works on those particular systems. And this is already something that should be going on, especially if you take into consideration threats like social engineering in general. Now, the first sort of process that's going to be part of this response plan is going to be incident detection. And this is basically identifying signs of a cyber attack, and that could be done by unusual login attempts, file changes, or system errors. And this is effectively going to be done by using monitoring tools, looking at system logs, and then maybe having a system to issue alerts. So you should have a strong set of tools in place to alert you to any possible behavior, but also you might want to be doing some manual analysis to go through and make sure everything is the way it should be. And this is super important because this allows organizations to respond quickly, limiting the access that attackers would have to a system, even if they manage to breach it. Now, an example of what an incident detection protocol would look like, and by protocol I mean a set of steps that would be part of the incident detection, would be to continually be monitoring all critical systems using things like antivirus software, firewalls, and SIEMs. I actually don't know what these are, but I assume they're just tools to be monitoring things like logs and different types of real-time data in a system. You'll want to be collecting and securely storing logs from servers at all times. So this way, even if you don't immediately detect an error, you have logs you go look at to get a timeline of what happened. You want to have a system to classify alerts by severity. So there might be some issues that pop up that are of low severity and some that are of high severity. And this really helps in communicating across your organization with regards to what's going on in the system and how people should react. And as part of this protocol, you might want to have a system in place where if an alert is serious or confirmed, then you're escalating immediately to a security team. This might be an external security team that could handle a more difficult threat, right? So this might be even just going beyond the IT staff. And this might include a response coordinator and senior management who is generally responsible for the institution as a whole. And as part of this, you might be recording all the information for what's going on during a particular incident. So this is an example, but this could be like a set of steps or a set of actions that need to take place as part of incident detection. So you're basically continually monitoring systems, you have a system of classification, and then you have a protocol in place, whereas if there's a serious alert, there's certain people you're going to notify and you're going to ask for help. And that might include not only senior management, but also an external security team or a dedicated security team in your IT department. And here's an example of what that might look like. So an unusual login behavior is detected. So at 3 a.m., the hospital's security monitoring system flags multiple failed login attempts at the electronic health records system from an internal IP address, so from an IP address inside the system, which could actually indicate that someone's already breached the system. An alert is triggered by the SIEM system. And again, I'll probably clarify what this is in the study guide and add a slide. I'm not entirely sure what SIEM stands for, but I assume this is just a system that sends an alert based on some irregular activity in a system. And so an alert is being sent off to an IT security team. The security team checks logs, and these logs show suspicious activity. And so based on that, the IT team launches an investigation. So they begin responding to the actual situation. They begin the incident response protocol, which is what we'll talk about as part of the next stage. Okay, so next we're going to discuss what the response looks like. So in responding to a cyber attack, As part of your response plan, you're going to want to contain the threat quickly. So isolate systems that are known to be affected or accounts that may be compromised. So that might be just disabling those accounts, possibly deleting those accounts, making sure you're stopping the attacker from getting further access to your system or from malware from spreading. And this could basically be taking, for example, a particular computer on the system and cutting it off from the network, right? And just isolating it. Once you detect something, so if you detect, for example, malicious code, an exploit, or malware, you might want to install an update to close those vulnerabilities and perhaps just remove that particular malware or malicious code. And another part of your response strategy might be just to recover. So you might want to restore systems from clean backups and monitor for signs of reinfection. So of malware just reconstituting itself on this updated system. Although this is really more a part of the next part, which is the recovery. But really, you want to contain the threat and try to eliminate the cause in the actual response phase of this response plan. So a protocol might be to immediately contain the threat, block unauthorized access to the systems or system as a whole, disable compromised accounts and isolate any systems that are affected, perhaps cutting them off from the network. You might then eliminate the threat by removing any malicious files or code, closing exploited vulnerabilities, and making sure that any ways the attacker could access a particular system or systems are neutralized. And then document everything that's happened, right? And this would have to be spread across your organization, both for compliance purposes and just to make sure that everyone is aware that something has happened and have them be on the lookout for any possible irregularities in the system. Then finally, you're going to have your recovery processes as part of your response plan. So this could be restoring affected systems. So generally, you're going to want to continually back up your system, right? So this usually happens every day or every week, where all the data on your systems and also like the operating system as a whole is backed up. So that way you could easily just wipe your entire system clean and then just reload this onto your system, and it'll continue to function as it was before. So you want to make sure that you're backing up your system so that you can use a clean backup, potentially from before this incident. And you would know when this incident started if you monitor your logs. And you want to do that so that your system is working as it was before, and the people who are part of your institution have access to it, particularly patients. One thing to keep in mind is that you would have to update. So you would want to apply security improvements. So this might be patches or change configurations to make sure that the attack that occurred would not be possible again. And additionally, you want to continue to closely monitor the systems to make sure that there aren't any lingering issues. For example, there isn't some malware that has reconstituted itself, or there isn't just someone trying to attack the system again. And so a possible recovery protocol as part of the response plan could be to restore the affected electronic health record system in the case of a hospital, or just really in general restore any affected systems by a clean, verified backup, so data that's been backed up. Make sure that only the correct people have access to it. And this could be you might want to create new accounts for everyone, or simply just for administrators, to make sure that if there are any accounts that are compromised, that those no longer have access. There'll be a continuous system of testing to make sure that the system's operating as a whole and there isn't any malware that's continuing to function in the system. And then a full review is conducted to make sure that all of the vulnerabilities that were taken advantage of during a possible cyber attack have been patched, and that security policies have been changed to make this type of cyber attack impossible in the future. Okay, so the last part of this video is going to be on ethical considerations. And there are a few things to take into consideration from an ethical perspective. So first, generally when working at patient data, there are a lot of regulations that need to be followed, and this varies by country. In the United States, there's something called HIPAA, and these are basically a set of rules that ensure that no unauthorized access should be given to patient data, and that sensitive medical data in general shouldn't be exposed to those who don't have access. And this means that oftentimes when penetration testers need to work with medical institutions, they need to obtain written authorization, not only from the institution, but depending on the country, maybe even from the patients in order to be able to work with that data. Now, this may be simplified if, for example, the patients have given the institution the authorization to not necessarily make use of their data, but to allow their data to be open to, for example, some sort of security testing or protocols. The point is, any security team or penetration testing team would need to have some sort of written authorization be working around this data. Additionally, this is going to take place in the first phase, but testers would need to follow a defined scope. And this just basically means that they can only work or target certain systems. And once they get access to those systems, there are only certain things they're allowed to do. Now, this might either follow some sort of formal regulations, again, depending on the country, or this might simply follow a protocol that's set by the hospital that relates to government regulations surrounding data access or data privacy for medical data. But the point is, there's going to be a certain boundary of behavior that can take place, and of even potentially systems that can be accessed and manipulated. And a penetration system or a penetration team would need to work within that boundary in order for them to be able to ethically carry out their activities. Now, data is obviously a huge target of any cyber attack, and keeping this data confidential and ensuring its integrity, meaning that it's still readily accessible and is not corrupted in any way, meaning that data isn't lost or it's not turned into a format that's not accessible, it's going to be super important. So this means that during penetration testing, steps need to be taken to make sure data isn't altered or lost during testing. So this means that the operations that a penetration tester might try to execute, such as data exfiltration, or for example, when we looked at the SQL injection example, there was a SQL command that could have been used to delete all of the users in a database. This may be something that just is not going to be possible, right? Or we might set up dummy databases, we might set up dummy data systems that could be used for penetration testing. This is something that the penetration testers have to work with the IT team in order to set up. Furthermore, in order to act ethically, this testing team would need to make sure that the systems are in place and make sure that they're acting in a way that ensures that healthcare data remains accurate, so it's not being altered, is complete and reliable, so it can be readily accessible, and it's not really being changed in any way, even when there's a simulated attack. And again, this could be addressed by working with the dummy system, or simply just not directly accessing the systems related to patient health records. So exploring the possibilities, so maybe gaining access to them, but once access is gained to them, not looking at them, not carrying out any actual operations in the system itself. And I would say that finally, like one really big safeguard that could ensure that that could help ensure that penetration testing is occurring in an ethical manner would be to just back up your data, right? Just to make sure that all the patient data is backed up at another site, separate from the system, so that if anything goes wrong, then the patient data can just readily be reinserted into the system, and operations can continue as normal. And again, there's certain protocols that have to surround how that backed up data is stored and secured, but nevertheless, just having another copy of that data is a way to ensure that this whole process is being done in an ethical manner, and that the risk to patient data that's critical to patient health is minimized. Now, this is probably more of an issue with healthcare or with healthcare institutions than it is with other types of institutions. But making sure that making sure that the IT system continues to function is a part of ethics. And this is because, first of all, incidents with patients, so health issues can occur at any time of day, at any time. And to address these, oftentimes doctors, medical staff are going to need access to electronic health records, life support machines that are connected to the network, and appointment scheduling. So, I mean, a way to conduct penetration testing in an ethical manner could be scheduling testing during low risk periods, so off-peak hours. This could be, for example, during the night. It could be during certain maintenance windows. Perhaps I wouldn't say during the weekend, but there's not really a good way. There's not really a good way to do this. I mean, it would have to just be like, yeah, sometime where everyone knows there's going to be fewer patients. And another way could be to just replicate the system and conduct testing on that. But again, replicating a system at a secondary location or in the cloud isn't really going to be the most realistic, right? Another way to do this is simply to conduct penetration testing in a way that doesn't take the system offline. So we could prioritize techniques that assess security without overloading the system or causing service outages. I mean, realistically, to go in and see whether you can get access to a database or boot your system and see whether you can get access to a database doesn't necessarily have to take the system offline. Now that would be unauthorized behavior that would be logged, but running a password cracking tool to get access, to get a password to log into the system, and then just seeing whether you can access patient data, that may not necessarily take the system offline. That's not like a denial of service attack that would just take that completely overload the system and stop it from working, right? So the methodology of the penetration testing team might necessarily be limited to methods that aren't going to take the system offline in the interest of patient health and of keeping critical systems online to ensure the health of patients. Now, kind of the last ethical aspect that we're going to talk about is going to be reporting responsiveness. So beyond just the responsibility that a security team has to respect the integrity and security of patient data, as well as the functionality of a healthcare IT system, they also have sort of an ethical responsibility towards reporting responsiveness. So testers need to document findings in a way both technical and non-technical staff can understand, so that as a whole, the organization is able to comprehend what the threats are to their particular systems and how those could be addressed. So highlighting risks, potential impacts on patient care. Because when you're talking about patient care, this is not just relevant to IT staff, right? This is also relevant to the medical specialists or the medical staff that is working at the institution. Critical vulnerabilities should be reported immediately so the organization can act quickly to prevent real-world threats. Again, these can have an impact on people's health. So a certain amount of urgency is kind of an ethical obligation, right? And this can kind of depend. I mean, certain penetration testing teams might only just do it once, and that might be the end of their engagement. But there might be a security team, or there might be penetration testers that are more consistently responsible for the security of an organization. And so in that case, they'd have an ethical obligation to act in a very responsive and urgent manner. Finally, testers should be available to explain findings, assist with fixes, and verify issues have been properly resolved. So this could be this is going to be a continuation kind of the testing, of the reporting and the post-exploitation phase. But it could be argued that, again, this kind of depends on the level of engagement the testers have with the actual institution itself. But at the very least, testers have an obligation to explain their findings in a way that everyone can understand, so that those could then be addressed as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible by the security team and whoever is responsible for actually securing the system itself at that organization. Now, I kind of want to look at the ethics of pen testing, and so it's kind of the pros and cons of penetration testing with regards to ethics, right? So looking at the pros and cons with regards to the ethics of pen testing itself. Now, some of the pros are that we are protecting patient privacy through pen testing, right? The point is to help better secure patient data. We're strengthening system security, not only to sort of protect patient data, but also to make sure that the system continues to function, even in the midst of a cyber attack. This kind of allows us to build public trust. If we're showing a community, if we're showing our patients that we're actively trying to find out what the vulnerabilities of our system are that holds their data and that's responsible for their patient care, and then solve any problems that come up as a result of our testing of that system, then people are going to trust us more, particularly our patients. And finally, when we do pen testing, this kind of gives the staff as a whole a better idea of what a cyber threat looks like and can help them respond to cyber threats, which can reduce harm both to patients, to the system integrity itself, and to the administrators from both a legal perspective and in terms of them being able to do their job effectively during an actual attack. There are cons. So testing could disrupt systems that are critical to patient health. So a penetration tester by accident could bring the system down or some part of the system down. We could be exposing data to the outside world if the testing isn't done in the most efficient, or rather if it isn't done in the most careful manner, right? So if, for example, a breach is done that opens that system up to the internet, or that creates some sort of access pathway to the public internet that wouldn't normally exist, then that could potentially expose data to the outside world. Or even, for example, if maybe data exploitation is done and then that data isn't properly secured on the system it's exfiltrated to, that could be scope for data exposure. There could be scope overreach, so testers might exceed their authorized scope and this could breach ethical boundaries. They might go a little further than they should. This could be by on accident, or this could just be due to ego. And this could lead to a false sense of security if the team that has done this penetration testing is not competent or didn't do a good job, right? So you might hire a penetration testing team, penetration testing team, and you don't really know that they're not very good at their job. But they go through your system and they say, oh, everything's secure. And you think that it is secure when in reality it isn't, and they're just bad at their job. And that could lead to a false sense of security, which may make an organization unnecessarily complacent with regards to the threat of cyber attacks. Now that brings us to the end of this video. I will be releasing resources for sale for this case study, including slides, study guides, predicted papers, and I'll also include some vectors and links to further research in that particular study guide. Additionally, I'll probably add some additional information for some terms that came up during this case study, but I didn't sufficiently address. So you can find all of that in a link in the description, and that'll be for sale usually, I'm thinking probably about $3.99. Additionally, I'd just like to kind of talk a little bit about where this channel is going and what I'm currently working on. So this is going to be, this video, this case study is part of the old curriculum, the curriculum that's been around since 2014. There's going to be a new curriculum released in it's already been released, but it's going to be it's first taught this year, and then the first exam is going to be in 2027, which is why I call it the 2027 curriculum, and work on that is ongoing. It actually contains a lot more content than the previous curriculum, than the curriculum that this video is related to. So it's taking quite a bit of time, and I'm not in a hurry because, again, the exam isn't going to be until 2027. But work on that is ongoing. I'll probably put some teasers up on my channel, either for members only or just in general, in the coming months. Anyways, I hope this video has been useful, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.